There were 50 of our own people standing in the dust of the motor pool when it went down. 50 soldiers with their eyes glued to the dirt, pretending to turn wrenches but catching every single detail. Captain Marcus Stone honestly believed he held all the cards that morning. He thought authority was something you could wield like a club, but he was about to learn a brutal lesson. Accountability doesn't ask for your permission, and it sure as hell doesn't wait for a convenient time to show up. I watched him pour a steaming mug of black coffee right over Casey's head, right there in front of the entire maintenance detail. He smirked and called it a leadership lesson. I'll never forget the sight of Casey standing there as that hot, dark liquid ran down her forehead, dripping off the bridge of her nose and soaking into her clean digital camouflage uniform. It was the kind of humiliating public ambush designed to break a junior officer's composure. But she didn't flinch. She didn't scream, and she didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her hands shake. Instead, she whispered a single sentence. She didn't say it loud enough for Stone to hear, nor for the 50 soldiers who were desperately trying to look like they weren't witnessing a career-ending disaster. She said it strictly to herself, using the exact, quiet rhythm her father had taught her back when she was just a kid learning how to handle a rifle. It was the mantra you run through before you make a definitive choice. The words that keep you steady when every instinct in your body is screaming at you to hit back. Document everything. Keep your ledger completely clean and let the system do its job, or dismantle the system if it refuses to. Exactly 48 hours later, her father's Black Hawk helicopter rattled the windows of the Tactical Operations Center as it touched down on the gravel. Casey hadn't placed a single phone call to him. Not one. But if you think that's where the drama ends, you're looking at the wrong map. That wasn't the conclusion. Honestly, it wasn't even the real starting point. This whole ordeal is really about what took place during those highly critical 19 minutes between a scalding cup of coffee hitting a uniform and the official digital timestamp on a formal complaint. It's a deep dive into what genuine discipline looks like when the price of staying calm is incredibly high and the urge to burn the whole place down is almost overwhelming. To really understand how we got there, you have to understand the pressure cooker of FOB Harrington. By the time this happened, Casey had already put in 7 grueling months on this deployment. But more importantly, she'd spent 27 years growing up under the roof of a high-ranking officer, watching her father navigate the sharp, unforgiving corners of military hierarchy at the highest levels. She recognized exactly what Stone was trying to do the second he stepped onto her turf. He was trying to assert dominance, to mark his territory because his own logistics timelines were slipping and hers were flawless. She looked up from her clipboard and locked her eyes right onto his. It was the look of someone who was completely done waiting for a bully to run out of steam. "Sergeant First Class Davis," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the generators. She didn't call him Davis. She used his full, formal title, speaking with the cold precision of a court reporter correcting a transcript. "He's the finest NCO in this brigade, sir, and his maintenance logs are immaculate. Do you have any actual questions about our readiness?" Stone stared at her. He scanned the 50 soldiers scattered along the maintenance line. Most of them were holding tools, but nobody was actually working. If you've spent 5 minutes around military personnel, you know they have an Olympic-level ability to monitor a power struggle without ever looking up. They hear every sigh, every shift in posture, every silent insult. They knew exactly what Stone was trying to pull. Stone realized he'd backed himself into a corner. He had 2 choices, back down or double down. He chose the wrong one. He let a slow, nasty grin spread across his face. Not the smile of a man who realized he'd crossed a line, but the smirk of a guy who decided the only way out was to escalate. He reached down and picked up a heavy, full ceramic mug resting on the hood of a nearby utility truck. He looked at Casey, his grin widening. "You're looking a little wound up this morning, Lieutenant," he said. "Let me help you take the edge off." And then he tipped the mug forward. The entire motor pool went dead silent. The only sound was the faint hiss of hot coffee hitting the hot metal of the engine block. Steam curled up from Casey's collar. For 3 agonizing seconds, She did not move. I want to pause right there, because those 3 seconds are where the entire story lives. Everything that followed, the official investigation, the statements, the high-ranking intervention, the ruined careers, was decided in those 3 seconds of absolute stillness. Part 2. The 12-minute fuse. During those 3 seconds, the entire motor pool held its collective breath. Everyone was waiting for the explosion. We all knew what was at stake. If Casey snapped, if she lunged at Stone or even screamed at him, she would immediately become the problem. In the Army's eyes, the instigator of a mess often gets lost in the noise of a chaotic reaction. Stone was counting on her losing her cool. He wanted her to scream so he could write her up for insubordination, paint her as emotional, and sweep his own incompetence under the rug. But Casey didn't give him an inch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even wipe the coffee from her eyes. Instead, she slowly looked down at the clipboard nestled under her arm, clicked her pen, and made a neat, steady notation right there in the maintenance log. Her hand wasn't even shaking. Then, she unclipped her radio from her vest and keyed the mic. Her voice came through the static, completely level and deadpan. "Davis," she said, "the tire inspection on Vehicle 3 is our immediate priority. I need it completely wrapped up and logged before 0800. "Copy that, ma'am." Davis's voice crackled back instantly. Now, if you knew Sergeant First Class Davis, and after 7 months of eating dust together at Harrington, we all knew him, you could hear the raw, unspoken weight behind those 3 words. It wasn't just a standard acknowledgement. It was a promise. It was him saying, "I saw what he did, Lieutenant. We all did. We've got your back." Casey clipped the radio back to her vest, turned on her heel, and began the 40-meter walk back to her office. She didn't run, and she didn't rush. She walked with the measured, deliberate pace of someone who had already calculated her next 5 moves. The only sound in that dead-silent yard was the crunch of her boots in the dirt, leaving dark, wet coffee prints behind her. She shut her office door, sat down at her desk, and did absolutely nothing for 12 minutes. If you've never been in a situation like that, 12 minutes of silence might look like hesitation. It might look like someone breaking down, hiding from the world, or trying to find the courage to face what just happened. But that's not what those 12 minutes were. Not even close. Those 12 minutes were a chemical process. It was the exact amount of time Casey needed to cool her rage down, process it, and refine it into a highly pressurized, usable weapon. She had learned how to do this when she was 19 years old. She'd come home from college absolutely furious because a power-tripping softball coach had benched her for the season. Not because of her stats, which were flawless, but because of petty athletic department politics. She had been ready to storm back to the campus, find the athletic director, and let loose a screaming match that would have felt fantastic for about 10 minutes, right before it ruined her entire academic career. Her father had sat her down at the kitchen table. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was just a dad holding a mug of tea, looking at his daughter with a lifetime of hard-won restraint behind his eyes. "Anger is incredible fuel, Casey," he had told her, his voice quiet. "But it's a terrible steering wheel. You have to decide where it goes. If you don't actively point it at a target, it will scatter, go somewhere entirely wrong, and blow up in your face." It took 8 years in uniform for Casey to truly master that lesson. But sitting in that humid plywood office at FOB Harrington, the training took over. She watched the digital clock on her computer screen. At exactly 07:19, she opened up the standard military incident report template. Her fingers hit the keys with the steady, economic rhythm of a seasoned professional. She wasn't typing a dramatic diary entry. She was building a cage. She filled out the metadata first. Date: August 14th, 2016. Time: 07:12 hours. Location: FOB, Harrington Motor Pool, grid reference 44, North 412578. Reporting Officer, 1st Lieutenant Casey Brooks, Logistics Officer, 5th Brigade Support Battalion. Subject of report: Captain Marcus Stone, XO, Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion. Then came the summary. It was a masterpiece of clinical detachment. At 07:12 hours, Captain Stone entered the motor pool without prior appointment or stated operational purpose. Following a brief exchange regarding maintenance scheduling, Captain Stone poured a full cup of hot coffee over the reporting officer's head. She added his exact quote right before he did it, word for word. "You seem a little wound up, Lieutenant. Let me help you with that." Under the witness section, she didn't just write, "the motor pool." She attached the active duty roster for maintenance detail 601200, which lists certified every single one of the 50 soldiers standing in that yard. She attached Davis's maintenance log, proving Vehicle 3's tire inspection had been pre-scheduled hours before Stone ever showed up. That detail was critical. It proved she wasn't lagging behind, that Stone's leadership lesson was entirely unprovoked, and that his criticism was an outright lie. At the very bottom, she added one final, devastating line. Reporting officer did not respond verbally or physically to the subject's action. She read it over twice, adjusted 2 words for legal clarity, and read it a third time. At exactly 07:31, 19 minutes after the coffee hit her head, she slotted her common access card into the reader and digitally signed the file. Her uniform was still wet, but the trap was set. Part 3. The Command Decision. I didn't route that report to Stone's battalion commander. I routed it straight to my own. Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Fitch was the commanding officer of the 5th Brigade Support Battalion, and she was not a woman you wanted to cross. She had 19 years in uniform, had commanded troops in 3 different combat theaters, and had spent nearly 2 decades watching how military institutions handled complaints, and, more importantly, how they usually failed to handle them. She knew exactly what kind of rot could settle into a unit when leadership chose convenience over accountability. My computer screen showed she received the report at 07:34. She read it in exactly 4 minutes. At 07:38, my desk phone rattled. "Get over to my office," Fitch said. "Now." I spent exactly 7 minutes scrubbing the dried coffee off my skin and throwing on a fresh, crisp set of ACUS. When I walked into Fitch's office, I looked like I was ready for an inspection, not like a lieutenant who had been humiliated in front of her entire platoon less than an hour ago. I carried a physical printout of the incident report, the roster, and the maintenance logs. I stood at absolute attention in front of her desk until she finally looked up and gestured toward the empty chair. "Sit down, Brooks," she said, her voice low and measured. She looked at the papers in her hand, then looked back up at me. "Tell me what happened, and don't give me the polished, bureaucratic translation. Tell me what actually went down out there." I appreciated that. It told me everything I needed to know about where Fitch stood. She didn't want the sanitized, politically safe version. She wanted to feel the heat of the fire so she could gauge the caliber of the officer sitting in front of her. I kept my voice in the exact same level, professional register I'd used on the radio. It wasn't a performance. It was a boundary I chose to draw. I described Stone's arrival, his attitude, the exchange about the maintenance schedule, the coffee, and my walk back to the office. I didn't exaggerate a single detail, and I didn't minimize a damn thing either. I laid it out chronologically, the way a veteran detective recounts a crime scene. Fitch listened without interrupting, her eyes locked on mine. When I finished, she let a heavy silence hang in the room for a moment, testing my comfort with the quiet. "How are your soldiers handling it?" she asked finally. "They're watching me, ma'am," I said directly. "They're waiting to see what I do with this. If I let it go, they learn that the rules don't apply to people with railroad tracks on their chest." Fitch gave a single, slow nod. It was the correct answer, and she knew it. It was the answer of an officer who understood that leadership isn't about protecting your own ego. It's about protecting the integrity of the unit. "I'm forwarding this straight to the Inspector General and to Colonel Patterson," Fitch said. Patterson was Stone's battalion commander. "You know what kind of storm that's going to kick up, right?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "And you should also know that Captain Stone has 2 prior informal complaints in his permanent file." Fitch paused, her eyebrows arching. "How exactly do you know that, Lieutenant?" "I called the JAG office at 07:15, ma'am, before I officially submitted the report. I spoke with Captain Torres, and she's already drafting a formal legal memo to attach to the file. It establishes a clear, documented pattern of behavior." Fitch stared at me. She looked down at the digital timestamp on the printout, 07:31. Then she looked back at me, her expression a mix of surprise and sheer, professional appreciation. "Most officers in your position would have taken 24 hours to cry, vent, or figure out if they even wanted to risk their career by filing," Fitch said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You did all of this in 19 minutes, while your uniform was still soaked." "The longer you wait to file, ma'am, the more the narrative shifts," I said. "People start doubting what they saw. Stories get aligned. I wanted the facts locked in while the coffee was still hot." Fitch leaned back in her chair, a cold, satisfied smile touching the corners of her mouth. It was the look of a commander who had just realized she wasn't dealing with a victim. She was dealing with a strategist. "Your father," Fitch said, shifting her tone slightly. "He arrives on base in 48 hours for the regional logistics review. Did you call him about this?" "No, ma'am," I said. "I haven't spoken to him." "He's going to see the report, Casey. It's going straight into his pre-arrival briefing package." "I know, ma'am," I replied. "I filed this report correctly because it was the right thing to do. I didn't file it to get my father to fight my battles for me. He'll see the documentation because the system works, not because I bypassed it." Fitch stood up, indicating the meeting was over. I snapped to attention and saluted. "Your father is going to be incredibly proud of that distinction, Lieutenant," she said. "He'll be proud of the paperwork, ma'am," I said. "He loves a clean file." Fitch actually laughed at that. "Go back to your motor pool, Brooks. You've got a convoy to run." I left her office and walked back out into the heat. I had a 22-vehicle resupply mission scheduled for 1300, and Vehicle 3's tires had already passed Davis's inspection. We were on schedule, we were prepared, and I had work to do. Colonel Rick Patterson had commanded the 3rd Battalion for 14 months, and to be completely fair, he wasn't a bad officer. In the story of how a unit falls apart, it's easy to paint the guy at the top as a cartoon villain. But Patterson was just a standard-issue bureaucrat who had made a series of logical, quiet management decisions that, when added together, amounted to a total disaster. His fatal flaw was simple. Whenever someone brought him proof that Marcus Stone had stepped across the line, Patterson managed it quietly. He didn't cover it up or bury it in a backyard. He just handled it over a cup of coffee. He'd bring Stone into his office, give him a stern, one-on-one talking to, write a private note for his personal desk drawer, and tell everyone to move on. He'd done this twice. And to Patterson, sitting in his air-conditioned office with his spreadsheets, that felt like good leadership. Stone is a high performer, he'd tell himself. He keeps Alpha Company's logistics green without me having to hold his hand. Sure, he's got a rough edge, but if I turn every personal conflict into a formal investigation, I'll destroy unit morale and create a crisis culture. It's a seductive kind of logic. It's exactly how almost every major corporation, sports team, and military unit handles toxic people who happen to produce results. But here is what Patterson didn't see, or deliberately chose to ignore. When you resolve a hostile incident informally, you send a devastatingly clear message to the person who was targeted. You tell them, "We care enough to listen to you cry, but we do not care enough to make a permanent record of your pain." And more importantly, you send an even clearer message to the predator. You tell them, "There are consequences, but they are private, they are toothless, and they will disappear the second you walk out of my office." Stone had received that exact message twice. He knew the system, and he'd calculated his margins perfectly. When he walked into my motor pool on the morning of August 14th, he was absolutely certain I wouldn't file a formal complaint. Not because he thought I was weak or scared, but because his entire experience in the Army had shown him that the system was built to absorb friction, resolve it quietly, and keep moving. He was still wearing that smug, satisfied look at 0900 when the battalion commander's office hadn't called him. By 1000, his grin was a little tighter. But by 1100, the confidence evaporated completely when Patterson's administrative assistant rang his line and told him to report to headquarters in service uniform immediately. When Stone walked into the office, Patterson wasn't looking at a spreadsheet. He was staring at the digital file forwarded by Lieutenant Colonel Fitch. Right next to it on his desk was Captain Torres's legal memo from the JAG office, highlighting the word pattern in bold black ink. That single word changed the entire mathematics of the room. Patterson had called his brigade legal advisor at 0930. The lawyer had read the 19-minute report and the attached NCO statements, looked at the history, and given Patterson a single, unvarnished directive: investigate, formally, with a paper trail and written findings. "Sir," Stone said, trying to summon his usual easygoing charm as he stood before Patterson's desk. "This is just a junior officer with a chip on her shoulder. It was a joke that landed wrong in a high-stress environment." Patterson looked up at him, and for the first time, there was no warmth in his eyes. "Marcus," Patterson said, his voice flat. "It's a lieutenant with 50 eyewitnesses, a formal JAG memo, and 2 prior complaints sitting in your record. The joke is over." Stone went quiet. The prior complaints, the ones he'd been told were handled, were suddenly staring him in the face. "Those incidents were resolved informally, sir," Stone said, his voice tightening. "You told me they were closed." "They were informally managed," Patterson shot back. "There's a massive difference. Informally managed means they stayed in my desk, but because Lieutenant Brooks filed a formal report 19 minutes after the fact, the JAG Corps pulled the string. They aren't closed anymore. They are now officially documented history." Stone stood there, the reality of the trap finally closing around him. He'd poured the coffee because he was sure she would take the hit and try to prove she was tough enough to handle it. He had misread her entirely. He thought her quietness in the motor pool was submission. He didn't realize she was just counting the seconds until she could build his casket out of black ink and regulations. Sergeant First Class Danny Davis had been keeping Army vehicles running for 16 years, through 3 deployments and under 8 different commanding officers. He had seen the absolute best of what the military had to offer, and he had seen the absolute worst. He knew how easily a bad leader could poison a unit, and he knew how hard it was to clean the rot out once it took hold. But what he saw at 0712 in the motor pool that morning was something completely new. He didn't just see a captain abuse his authority. He saw a junior officer execute a masterclass in tactical restraint. He watched Casey stand there for those 3 seconds, her uniform soaked in steaming coffee, and instead of losing her mind, she chose her weapon. He heard her voice on the radio, dry, level, and completely focused on the mission. He watched her walk those 40 yards to her office with the steady, unbothered stride of a woman who already knew she'd won. And then Davis turned his head and looked at Stone. Stone was still standing there on the dirt, wearing that smug, self-satisfied grin, waiting for the validation of the crowd. He wanted the soldiers to laugh, or at least look away in fear. Instead, Davis did something remarkable. Without saying a word, without coordinating with anyone, he slowly turned his back on Stone. The NCO standing next to him did the same. Then another. Within 5 seconds, all 5 of the senior NCOs on the line had turned their backs on the captain. It wasn't a loud, theatrical protest. It was the quiet, simultaneous decision of 5 veteran soldiers who had witnessed the same act of cowardice and reached the exact same conclusion. Stone's smile faltered. He looked around the silent yard, suddenly realizing that the power he thought he held had evaporated the second the coffee left his cup. He turned on his heel and walked away, but the damage was done. Davis didn't waste any time. He had Vehicle 3's tire inspection completed and logged by 0724, 6 minutes ahead of Casey's deadline. He swallowed a quick ration bar, wiped the grease off his hands, and walked straight to the JAG office at 0800. He didn't wait for an investigator to call him. He sat down and wrote a witness statement that was devastating in its simplicity and detail. He described the temperature of the coffee, the steam rising from Casey's collar, and the absolute stillness of her posture. He described the silence of the 50 soldiers. And he described, with clinical accuracy, the way the leadership of the motor pool turned their backs on a bully. "I've seen a lot of officers try to command through fear," Davis wrote at the end of his statement. "Lieutenant Brooks is the first one I've seen command through pure discipline. We are ready to follow her anywhere." By noon, 4 other NCOs had filed their own independent statements. They didn't coordinate. They didn't have a meeting. They just walked into the JAG office one by one and put their names on the record. I didn't even know they were doing it until Colonel Fitch called me back into her office at 1400. "Your Sergeant First Class submitted a formal statement," Fitch said, sliding a manila folder across her desk. "He's not my NCO, ma'am," I said quietly. "But he is the finest leader of soldiers I've ever had the privilege to work with." "It's not just him," Fitch said, leaning forward. "By noon, 4 more of your senior leads had filed, and as of 10 minutes ago, 37 of the 50 soldiers who were on that maintenance line have voluntarily submitted written statements to JAG. I sat there, the air leaving my lungs. 37 soldiers, out of 50. In the military, getting young soldiers to voluntarily stick their necks out against a senior officer is nearly impossible. They're terrified of retaliation, of being labeled troublemakers, of having their careers quietly derailed. But they had watched a first lieutenant take a humiliating blow, refuse to break, and walk straight to her computer to fight using the rules of the institution. They decided, one by one, that if she was brave enough to stand in the fire, they were brave enough to stand with her. "They saw what real leadership looked like, Casey," Fitch said, her voice unusually soft. "And they decided they wanted to be part of the record." She tapped the folder. "Your father lands in exactly 24 hours. This file is already airtight. When he reads this, he isn't going to see a family crisis. He's going to see a textbook operation." "That's exactly how I want him to see it, ma'am," I said. I stood, saluted, and walked back to the yard. The 1-300 convoy was already staged. The vehicles were humming, and my soldiers were waiting for my order. We had a mission to run, and nothing, not even Marcus Stone, was going to get in our way. Brigadier General Thomas Brooks landed at FOB Harrington at exactly 10:47 on the second day. He was 54 years old, had put 31 years of his life into the United States Army, and was currently awaiting Senate confirmation for his second star. He didn't travel with the theatrical entourage that some generals prefer. He arrived with a lean 4-person advance team, 2 trusted aides, and the quiet, intensely focused energy of a man who looked at logistics not as a back-office chore, but as the literal pulse of the military. My father didn't run reviews for show. He had served in 3 combat tours, and he had seen soldiers die because some supply chain officer somewhere had let a deadline slip or allowed a maintenance log to be faked. He knew the cost of cutting corners, and he hated lazy paperwork more than almost anything else. He got oriented, ate a quick meal at the chow hall, and then spent the next several hours reading every single incident report, administrative action, and maintenance log filed at Harrington over the previous 30 days. The report I had signed at 0731 on August 14th was sitting in the middle of his stack. He read it at 2200 in his quarters. He read it once, paused, and then read it a second time. He didn't pick up the phone to call me. He didn't call Colonel Fitch or Colonel Patterson. He simply placed the 19-minute report into his designated action pile, the small, critical stack of papers that demanded immediate, personal attention, and went to sleep at 2300. By 0500, he was up and running physical training in the dark. By 0700, his official review of the base logistics was underway. And by 0800, he was sitting in Lieutenant Colonel Fitch's office. "Let's talk about the prior complaints against Captain Stone," he said, skipping the small talk entirely. He was holding my file. "Yes, sir," Fitch said. 2 informal resolutions in his file, handled by his battalion command. The JAG notation is that the combination of those two incidents and Lieutenant Brooks's formal report establishes a clear, documented pattern of toxic conduct. And Patterson has opened a formal Article 156 investigation? Yes, sir. He signed the authorization yesterday afternoon. My father was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the dusty landscape outside Fitch's window. "What is the operational status of my officer?" he asked. He didn't say my daughter. He said my officer. Fitch caught the distinction immediately and respected it. "Lieutenant Brooks is fully operational, sir," Fitch replied. "She commanded the 1300 convoy on the day of the incident. 22 vehicles, dangerous route, 0 issues. Mission complete at 1847. He nodded, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. "Give me the full file." He stood by the window, letting the harsh morning light fall across the pages as he read. He read my clinical 19-minute report. He read Davis's detailed NCO statement. He read the 4 other lead statements filed before noon. And then he read the 37 voluntary witness statements written by the junior soldiers who had stood in that dust. When he finished, he let the silence stretch out in the room. Fitch didn't break it. She had worked with enough general officers to know when the silence was doing the heavy lifting. "The prior complaints," my father said, his voice dropping an octave. "What happened to the soldiers who filed them?" "One transferred out of the unit, sir," Fitch said. "The other is still in place. Both are male, and neither of them chose to file a formal complaint. Because the informal process told them that filing wasn't worth the trouble," he said. "Yes, sir," Fitch said. "That is my assessment." He picked up his patrol cap from the desk. "I'm scheduling a meeting with Colonel Patterson and Captain Stone," he said. "I also want to meet with First Lieutenant Brooks, professionally, to review her convoy records from the past quarter." He walked into my briefing room at 1400. I stood, snapped a crisp salute, and introduced myself by my rank and name. I didn't look at him as my dad. I looked at him as the brigadier general who was auditing my operation. I briefed him on our supply chain metrics, our vehicle readiness rates, our fuel consumption patterns, and the specific outcomes of the August 14th mission. I gave him the numbers with absolute, unflinching precision, keeping my tone completely neutral. He asked 11 highly technical questions. I gave him 11 direct data-backed answers. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said when I finished. "Dismissed." I saluted, turned on my heel, and walked out. After the door closed, my father sat alone in the empty briefing room for a long minute. He thought about the file he had read the night before. He thought about a cup of coffee at 0712, a 40-meter walk, a 19-minute timestamp, and 37 soldiers who had decided they were done staying quiet. And he thought about a 12-year-old girl he had taken to a shooting range outside Knoxville, teaching her to slow her breathing, find her center, and wait for the perfect moment before pulling the trigger. He had been trying to teach her about shooting back then, but really, he was teaching her about the space between the provocation and the choice. That space was where discipline lived. He stood up, adjusted his uniform, and prepared for his 1600 meeting with Patterson and Stone. My father met with Colonel Patterson and Captain Stone in the battalion command conference room at exactly 1600. There are plenty of people in this world who think authority has to scream to be heard. They think power is a performance. Shouting, slamming fists on tables, making everyone in the room feel small. But my father had spent 31 years learning that the loudest person in the room is usually the most terrified. Real, absolute authority doesn't need to raise its voice. It just needs a clean desk, a complete file, and a room with no exits. Colonel Patterson was present as the commanding officer. A JAG officer sat to his left as a legal advisor, and a court reporter sat in the corner, her fingers hovering over her machine. Stone walked in wearing his Class A service uniform. If you've spent more than 5 minutes around military officers, you would have recognized his posture instantly. He had spent the last 48 hours polishing his story. He'd practiced his tone, rehearsed his pauses, and figured out the exact level of sheepish, boys will be boys regret that usually got officers out of trouble. He stood just a fraction too tall, leaning into a confidence that was entirely unearned. "Captain Stone," my father said, his voice flat and perfectly level. "Tell me what happened in the motor pool on the morning of August 14th, in your own words." Stone took a breath and delivered his masterpiece. He described the incident as a momentary lapse in judgment in a high-pressure deployment environment. He called it a joke that had missed the mark, a playful bit of ribbing between officers that had unfortunately gone sideways. He said he deeply regretted the impact it had on Lieutenant Brooks and on the cohesion of the unit. He mentioned that he had already tried to apologize to me informally, and he assured the general that he was fully committed to cooperating with Patterson's investigation. It was a beautiful performance. It was smooth, it was humble, and it was engineered to slide right into the informal resolution slot that Patterson had kept open for him for over a year. My father didn't blink. He listened to every syllable without a single change in his expression. When Stone finally ran out of words, my father slowly turned his gaze to the JAG officer. "Read the prior complaints," he said. The lawyer opened the manila folder and began to read. He read the first informal complaint from a year ago. He read the second one from 6 months ago. He read the handwritten notes Patterson had tucked into his desk drawer, and then he read the formal legal memo Captain Torres had attached to my 19-minute report. As the lawyer read, the color slowly drained from Stone's face. The change wasn't dramatic, just a sudden tightness in his jaw, a slight widening of his eyes as he realized the ground was crumbling beneath his boots. The informal resolutions he thought had vanished into thin air were suddenly being read aloud in front of a brigadier general. He had assumed informally resolved meant deleted. He hadn't realized that informally managed simply meant the paper trail was waiting for someone with enough leverage to pull it into the light. "Captain Stone," my father said when the lawyer finished, "you have 2 prior documented complaints regarding your conduct with subordinates. Both were informally resolved, according to your commander." "Yes, sir," Stone said, his voice losing its polished resonance. "They were handled." "They were informally managed," my father corrected him, using the exact distinction Fitch had made. "There is a massive difference. Informally managed means they stayed in your history. And because Lieutenant Brooks filed a formal report 19 minutes after you poured coffee on her head, those records are now active. The JAG's assessment is that this is not a single, isolated lapse in judgment. It is a documented pattern of predatory behavior. A pattern." He let that word hang in the silent room. "Do you understand that distinction, Captain?" "Yes, sir," Stone whispered. My father leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. "First Lieutenant Brooks is my daughter," he said. The silence in that room became absolute. The court reporter's keys didn't even click. "She filed her formal report 19 minutes after the incident," he continued, "while her hair was still wet with your coffee. Now, I did not fly to this FOB because she is my daughter. I flew here because this outpost is in my regional review area, and what I have found here is a systemic failure of leadership, a pattern of toxic conduct that the informal process of this command completely failed to address." He turned his eyes to Colonel Patterson. Patterson sat completely rigid, his face pale, staring straight ahead. "Colonel Patterson, your decision to informally manage these prior complaints will be a primary focus of my regional review report," my father said. "We will address both the conduct of this captain and the administrative process that allowed him to believe he could behave this way without consequence." Patterson swallowed hard. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice completely hollow. "Good," my father said, standing up and capping his patrol cap. "My completed report will be on the commanding general's desk in 72 hours. This meeting is over." The formal investigation took exactly 8 days to wrap up. In the Army, an Article 156 investigation usually drags on for months, buried under mountains of bureaucratic stalling. But my 19-minute report, Davis's NCO statement, and the 37 voluntary witness statements had built a vault with no key. Captain Joel Marcus Stone was found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer under Article 133 of the UCMJ. The investigation recommended a Permanent General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand, GOMOR, to be filed in his official military record, a career-killing document that guaranteed he would never see another promotion. They stripped him of his company leadership, barred him from any future command positions, and reassigned him to a rear support desk job in Kuwait for the remainder of the deployment. Colonel Patterson didn't face a formal reprimand, but the finding of failure to maintain a professional command climate was permanently etched into his evaluation file. His chances of ever wearing a star of his own were gone. When Colonel Fitch handed me the official copy of the findings, I was sitting at my desk reviewing the next day's fuel delivery schedule. I read the pages once, folded them neatly, and slid them into my desk drawer. Fitch stood there watching me. "You're not going to say anything, Brooks?" "About what, ma'am?" I asked, looking back up at my screen. "The findings." "The career wreckage. Your father." "The findings are accurate, ma'am," I said. "The investigator did his job, and my father did his. I did my job, Davis did his, and 37 of our soldiers did something they weren't even required to do. That's the only part of this story that actually matters to me." "The 37. Fitch looked at me for a long, quiet moment, a shadow of respect crossing her face. "You really are his daughter, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, a small smile finally breaking through. "I've been told we share a certain appreciation for a clean file." 3 months after the investigation closed, I found myself commanding a 6-vehicle resupply convoy through a relentless, freezing rain in the Kunar province. The mountain roads had turned to slick, dangerous clay. Every mile was a fight against the terrain, a slow crawl through a landscape that didn't care about our schedules or our missions. Sergeant First Class Davis was riding in my passenger seat, his eyes locked on the dark curves of the pass ahead. We hadn't spoken about Marcus Stone, the motor pool, or the investigation since the day the findings were filed. Not because we were avoiding the topic, but because the work had simply claimed all our focus. In our world, the most genuine form of closure isn't a long conversation. It's the quiet, shared commitment to the next mission. "How's Vehicle 4 holding up, Davis?" I asked, keying the radio. "Running clean, ma'am." The vehicle commander's voice crackled back through the static. "Belts are tight, traction is holding, all systems nominal." We delivered the parts to a forward outpost that had been waiting on resupply for 11 days. The mission wrapped up at 1743, with all 14 of my soldiers returning to the gates of Harrington safe, dry, and accounted for. I sat in my office and completed the after-action report, hitting the submit key at exactly 19:03. Then, I walked over to the mess hall and ate a quiet, solitary dinner, enjoying the peaceful stillness that only comes after a long day of keeping people alive. At 2100, an email from my father popped up on my laptop. He didn't mention the investigation, Stone, or the political fallout of his regional review. Instead, he wrote about a supply chain bottleneck he was analyzing in a completely different sector. He asked for my perspective on how to bypass it. I spent 45 minutes drafting my reply. I detailed 3 alternative routing strategies I'd tested during my 3rd month of deployment and laid out a pre-positioning protocol I'd developed to stage critical supplies at intermediate points. It was a system that had quietly cut our delivery delays by 30%. He wrote back at 06:30 his time with 4 highly specific, technical questions about my protocol. I answered them at 0700, right between my morning maintenance walk and my mission briefing. That was our relationship. It wasn't defined by a dramatic rescue at a motor pool, or a general using his stars to shield his daughter. It was 2 logistics officers, senior and junior, father and daughter, working a complex problem together across different hemispheres. We were just 2 people who had chosen, for our own separate reasons, to take the work entirely seriously. I was promoted to captain in 2018 and to major in 2021. After 12 years of service, I hung up my uniform and took a leadership role managing global logistics for international disaster relief operations. Over the decade that followed, I worked in some of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. I rebuilt supply lines after earthquakes in Nepal, managed food distribution during historic floods in Bangladesh, coordinated famine relief in East Africa, and led emergency shipping efforts after Category 5 hurricanes tore through the Caribbean. In disaster relief, the stakes of logistics shift in a terrifying way. In the military, a delay means operational friction or unit degradation. In disaster response, if your trucks don't move, people don't eat. If your cold chain fails, insulin and vaccines spoil. If your water purification systems are late, cholera takes the village. When I hire managers for my relief teams now, I don't care about the polished answers they give during a quiet interview. I hire for the 19-minute window. I look for the people who, when hit with a sudden, humiliating crisis, don't scream, don't panic, and don't make themselves the center of the drama. I look for the ones who can cool their rage into clinical accuracy, document the facts, and trust the process to work, or know exactly how to work the process when it gets stuck. You can usually identify those people within 10 minutes of conversation. They're the ones who run toward the hardest, most disorganized parts of a problem, because they know that discipline is the only thing that actually survives the chaos. Looking back, the 50 soldiers standing in that dusty motor pool are the ones I think about most. Not my father's helicopter landing on the base, not the career-ending reprimand Stone received, nor the black mark on Patterson's record. I think about the 37 soldiers who weren't required to say a word, but chose to stand up anyway. They had watched a junior officer take a heavy, public blow, refuse to break, and walk 40 yards in a wet uniform to do her job. They saw what real, quiet authority looked like, and they decided, one by one, that they wanted to be a part of that standard. My father had shown me how to find that quiet space before making a decision. I had shown those 50 soldiers, and they, in turn, would show the troops who eventually served under them. The tree keeps growing, the static of the world gets filtered out, and the signal only gets clearer. That is the work that persists. That is the legacy I carry. Not the memory of a hot cup of coffee thrown in my face, and not the cheap satisfaction of watching a bully ruin his own career. It is the absolute, unshakable knowledge that at 07:12 on August 14, 2016, I was tested in the space between the blow and the reaction. And I chose correctly. There are versions of this story where the general is the hero who swoops in to save the day. There are versions where the formal investigation is the triumph of justice, or where the lesson is simply about having the right last name and the right connections. But that version completely misses the point. My father didn't create the outcome of that day, he merely confirmed it. He added institutional weight to a truth that had already been established before his Black Hawk ever cleared the horizon. What made the system work was a report filed at 07:31. What made that report lethal was its clinical accuracy, its lack of emotion, and its 19-minute timestamp. What turned it into a pattern was the phone call to JAG made before the coffee was even cold. And what gave us 37 witnesses was a 40-meter walk, taken at an even, unbothered pace. The general found the work already completed when he arrived. He put his signature on it, forwarded it, and used his office to ensure the bureaucracy didn't stall. But the shield was forged long before he touched down. It was built by one person's discipline and strengthened by 37 soldiers who chose to stand beside her. You don't need a general's rank to win the day. You just need your own discipline. The rank simply confirms what your character has already proven.